Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Craig. I'm a principal accessibility consultant at Technological, but I was formerly the head of accessibility at DWP for the Department for Work and Pensions in UK government, where I kind of did a lot of stuff around accessibility strategy and whatnot, which is some of the things that where I learned some of the things I guess that I'm going to share with you today. I guess for transparency, before we start, I have ADHD, I have autism. Um, Depending on which side wins, I suppose, the talk can either become really like erratic or like really clinical. So it's good to just kind of put that up front in case it does get a bit erratic. But yeah, ADHD and autism is an interesting combination because it means you often get erratic conversations with little to no eye contact. So if we ever meet in person, that's what you can expect to get. But yeah, in this talk, I'm going to be using terms like neurotypical, neurodivergent, and neurodiversity. So just to kind of outline those a little bit, because people aren't always sure exactly what they mean. Neuro just means brain. Typical obviously means typical. Divergent means differing from what is typical. So if somebody's neurodivergent, they think in a different way to that is considered to be normal. And neurodiversity is what happens when you get a bunch of people who all think in different ways kind of together. So you could have a bunch of people in a room and you could say that's a neurodiverse group of individuals, but you wouldn't kind of refer to one person as being neurodiverse. You would refer to them as being neurodivergent. So yeah, the term's only been around for about 20 years. And I think sometimes you see people saying, oh, this person's neurodiverse. So yeah, just I kind of outline those at the start. So when I'm using them, you kind of know what I'm talking about. And being non-typical is actually pretty typical. So when we talk about people being neurodivergent, around 15% of the population are thought to be neurodivergent, and the number is steadily increasing because there's more understanding around neurodiversity now, and there's more diagnosis getting done, especially later in life. Like I was late diagnosed with ADHD, and yeah, like when I was a kid, nobody had any kind of clues as to the behavioral things and whatnot. So I think as things are getting better and the awareness is improving, more people are getting diagnosed later on. So that number in the population is increasing of the number of people that are neurodivergent. I guess if we made up more than 50% of society, we'd be considered neurotypical. But at the moment, yeah, we're the neurodivergent ones. And in the past, like you probably wouldn't know you were neurodivergent unless you were diagnosed with a disorder. And we say disorder because like language matters. If you look at it, it's like autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, learning disorders such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, they're all considered to be disorders. And the term disorder implies chaos. It implies that you are not orderly or that you do not fit. And the problem with the word disorder is that it relies on context. So, for example, if you organized all of the books in a library by color rather than by, you know, genre or um, like alphabetical ordering or anything like that, if you literally just ordered them by color, visually there's a definite order there. You could go in the library and look around and you could see all these books ordered and people go, oh yeah, all the yellows books are over there and all the blue ones are over there. But pragmatically, you'd never find anything. And the librarian would have a real hard time trying to help you to find them things, like unless you knew the color of the book. But the books are disordered, but there's an order to them. So I think the term disorder is very contextual and it's a bit subjective in the way that we think about it. And neurodivergents have a very particular set of skills, and employers are starting to notice. And when I say we've got a very particular set of skills, we don't all have the same set of skills. We all kind of have different things that we're good at. But often, what you'll find with people who are neurodivergent is that they they are very good at certain things. So, like a lot of autistic people, for example, are really good at problem solving, logic, maths, those sorts of things. Um, and the problem is that when we define people as being disordered, we imply that they're somehow broken, and all of these good things that they're good at, they don't get the opportunity to do because we don't set work environments up in the right way so that these people are supported to do their best work. And with the right support and the right adjustments, and the right environment, like people who are neurodivergent like thrive, and research shows that they often actually excel in specialist roles and outperform neurotypical peers in a lot of roles. But if the organization isn't set up for that and they don't kind of really know how to cater for the needs of these people, then that kind of goes unnoticed. Um, and this is a quote from the Harvard Business Review. And this is many people with neurological conditions such as autism spectrum disorder, dyspraxia, and dyslexia have extraordinary skills, including pattern recognition, memory, and mathematics. So you look at this and you go, oh, that sounds positive. You know, they've recognized that these people are really good at these things. But if you pay close attention to the language, they talk about neurological conditions, they talk about autism spectrum disorder, they talk about, it's like the stigma still bleeds through in the language. Um, and I guess that means like there's a thin line between exploitation and culture change. It's good that people like me are being recognized for these extraordinary skills as they put them. But having the right environment in order to be able to do that stuff is really important. And I'm not sure reading these quotes that they potentially get that. So there's a lot of people who are potentially looking to hire people who are neurodivergent because they're like, oh, they're really good at these things. But when you talk about it in that way and you talk about them having neurological conditions and whatnot, then it doesn't really reflect the culture, I guess, doesn't really reflect what it is that you're trying to portray. This is another one, which is from the World Economic Forum. Um, and they say that many of the world's biggest companies are now actively recruiting neurodiverse workers in order to benefit from their unique skills and abilities. And again, if we look at the language, at first glance, you might think, oh, this is great. Like people want to hire people who are neurodivergent. But when we look at the language, first of all, they're using the term neurodiverse, which, as we established earlier, we see, people like you don't refer to somebody as being neurodiverse, so that's a bit of a red flag. Um, and then also we're saying, they're saying they recruiting them in order to benefit from their unique skills and abilities. And that's cool, but like what are they getting out of it? Hopefully that's a work environment which meets their needs and they're getting fairly compensated. And everything's kind of set up in a way where they're going to thrive, rather than it just being like, oh, we can benefit from these people and their kind of their way of thinking. So I guess why am I telling you this? The reason why I think this is important is that accessibility regulations and standards are getting better. You might have heard about some of these. We'll talk about them in a minute, but things like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and things like that. Um, there's a lot of the technical elements of accessibility are getting a lot better, but the culture and the attitudes of people that kind of run organizations and build products and whatever, that is not always progressing at the same pace. Um, and it means that although accessibility is improving through these mandated standards and compliance and those sorts of things, there's a lot of people who still don't understand or really care why it's important, and that leaves a lot of people still in the margins. So I guess in order to talk about why some of the shortcomings, I guess, of the regulations, I need to quickly cover them. People don't always realize they're breaking the law if they release something which is inaccessible, and regulations can be complex and scary and really difficult to understand. So strap yourself in. Like I'm not going to cover regulations and standards in depth. I'm going to just kind of go over them at a high level. Don't worry if you get a bit lost, like we all do. The amount of times that I'm still looking up parts of the legislation and those sorts of things because it's impossible to remember. So yeah, don't worry if the next few slides are a bit baffling. I don't expect, or that you don't need to retain it all, but it's just to kind of highlight the fact that these things exist. So in the United States of America, they have the Rehabilitation Act. They've got Section 508. They've got the Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 508 and the Rehabilitation Act are kind of the same thing. It's like Section 508 is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. But it basically means that all of these regulations at a high level means like if a business is a public place, that can be a digital or a physical space, then accessibility is expected. Um, and the Americans with Disabilities Act was actually published around 1990, so none of this is new, but it does mean that, if you're putting products out there and you're expecting people to buy them, then a level of accessibility is expected. With the election and things in America, like some of this, it looks like it's going backwards a little bit. But hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see how that pans out, but hopefully it won't disappear completely. But yeah, at the moment, it's very much still in the laws of America that things need to be accessible. In the United Kingdom, we have the Equality Act, we've got the Public Sector Equality Duty, and we've got the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations. The Equality Act itself is massive. It doesn't just cover disabilities. Disability is one of the 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act. So there's other things like race and gender and religion and those sorts of things. Um, and then the public sector bodies accessibility regulations is kind of an extension of that, which tells you very specifically how to make something accessible in order to meet the Equality Act for people with disabilities. So the Equality Act's really big and broad, but not very specific on how you do things. And then the public sector bodies accessibility regulations is very narrowly scoped in the sense that it's like you need to publish a statement and you need to make your website WCAG 2.1 compliant or whatever, 2.2 compliant. But accessible does not always mean inclusive. And I think this is an important point to make when we look at the Equality Act, because the Equality Act covers more than disability, you can still fail to meet the Equality Act even if you've got a fully accessible website. So, for example, if you had a really badly worded question about gender, you see it a lot in bad UXs where it's just like, what is your gender, male or female? And obviously there's a lot more genders that somebody could be. So you could be fully accessible, meeting all of the criteria for the people with disabilities, but you might fail to meet the criteria for other protected characteristics in the Equality Act. So it's just an important thing to note is that accessible does not always mean something's inclusive. The two aren't tied together. They're related, but they're not the same. There's a really good book called Design Justice if you want to broaden your thinking around designing for everybody and not just designing for accessibility. Design Justice gives a lot of really good real life examples of product design where they kind of highlight a problem and then they kind of highlight how that could have been better. And a lot of those are things to do with other kind of protected characteristics and whatnot, not just accessibility. In Europe, there is the EU Web Accessibility Directive, which informed a lot of the laws and regulations in the UK before we kind of left the EU. And they also have the European Accessibility Act, which the first deadline for that is this year. So that one's really new. But basically, with the European ones, they kind of the EU publishes these directives, and then all of the countries in the EU have to then meet that directive by implementing certain laws and regulations within their country that align with them. So the public sector bodies accessibility regulations in the UK was the way for the UK to meet the EU Web Accessibility Directive. So yeah, Brexit kind of complicates the UK's position on the European Accessibility Act because that came in after we left, which means that at the moment, the Accessibility Act cannot be enforced by the EU in the UK because we weren't a member state when they created it, but the UK may choose to adopt it anyway. So there's still a strong push for digital accessibility in this country, and the public sector body's accessibility regulations when it first came out was actually stricter than what it needed to be when it was brought in. So there's a good chance that the UK could adopt it anyway at some point. So it's just worth bearing in mind because a lot of people, I guess, when they look at accessibility, they're trying to look for what is the minimum we can do to get away with it. And I think if you ignore the European Accessibility Act because you think it doesn't apply to you, I think it could come back to bite you further down the line. But that's just my opinion. It's just a hunch. But it is worth pointing out that even if you ignore the European Accessibility Act, I don't recommend you do, but even if you did, under the current UK law, under the Equality Act, reasonable adjustments are still expected. That's still part of the law. So it's a little bit more subjective. What is a reasonable adjustment? But it's still illegal to discriminate against people based on their needs. So if you work to the European Accessibility Act, then you'll likely meet the obligations for reasonable adjustments in the UK, but not necessarily the other way around. So even if you don't follow that regulation, if you have users or employees or whatever that are using certain tools and they're not accessible, you'll still be expected to make adjustments so that they can still do their job and that kind of thing. And again, like I do recommend not ignoring it, but if you did voluntarily adopt the European Accessibility Act, then it means that you can kind of meet your obligations for reasonable adjustments. Product and services will not look inferior to EU competitors. So like if you do ignore it, you can, and I guess there'll be a situation that will arise at some point in the next sort of 5 to 10 years where the European products will all look really strong because they're following this new legislation. And if all of the UK companies ignore it, then they'll miss out on contracts and those sorts of things because they won't be able to sell their products in Europe basically without doing that work and retrofitting it later on. So that was kind of a whistle stop tour through all of the regulations. As I say, I don't expect you to remember it all or take it all in. Like I appreciate I've just bombarded you with a whole bunch of stuff. But it just kind of highlights the fact that these things exist and we do have to pay attention to the laws and whatnot. It's accessibility is not a nice to have. And I think there's another important point to make is that the laws and the regulations apply to the country that you're selling your product in. So if you're selling your product in Europe, it needs to apply the European Accessibility Act and those sorts of things. It's not where you're based. So it's not like, oh, we're a UK company, so EU law doesn't apply to us. If you're trying to sell your products into Europe, then they will apply. So the regulations are complex, but their intent is simple. And that is basically we must not deliberately or accidentally exclude anybody. We must actively work to be as inclusive as possible. And we must provide an equal level of service to everybody. So if we take all of those complex regulations and we just think about it as pragmatically as possible, this is kind of what it's looking to achieve. It's looking to make sure that people aren't discriminated against, people aren't excluded. Um, and then, yeah, moving on to accessibility standards. So again, I'll just quickly uh, cover these, but a lot of the laws and the regulations are all tied together with common standards. The laws kind of talk about what happens to you if you don't meet the standards, and the standards are kind of the way that you technically measure if something's accessible. So the EU uses a standard called EN 301549, which is hilariously inaccessible in its naming, but yeah, it is kind of ironic that the name of the standard is inaccessible, but yeah, EN 301549 is the name of the standard. This is the European standard for accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. This is basically it's a very specific way of measuring something. So if you take a website or a mobile application or some kind of piece of software, then EN 301549 is supposed to tell you what that software should, what the requirements are in order for it to be accessible. So you can actually test it against a set of standards, and then you can see whether it passes or fails. We have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are the ones that most people have heard of. This is the international standard from a technical point for like a website or a mobile application. Section 508, the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations, EN 301549, they all use WCAG within them as their measure. The current version is 2.2, and I think 3.0 is the next sort of big release, which isn't going to be, I don't even think we'll get it anywhere between, well, we'd be lucky if we've got it by like 2035, I think, based on the current timeline. So it's not like these things get updated often, so they should be relatively easy to stay up to date with any changes that do come in. They don't get updated very often, and I think yeah, sometimes I think people look at it and go, there's a lot to learn. How do we stay up to date with it? But once you've kind of learned it, even when they released new versions recently, there's normally only small changes to them. So they're a bit overwhelming at first, but they're not that difficult to stay up to date with once you've kind of got your head around them. There's also a standard called WCAG ICT, which is a version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that have been that are not web specific. They've kind of removed all the web specific stuff, and then you can apply this to things like ATMs or kiosks or I don't know, things you order or in McDonald's or whatever, like a big electronic till or something like that, which isn't a website, but a lot of the standards still apply. So, like I said before, there's a lot of regulations, and if you drill down into them all enough, you eventually usually get to WCAG. So, as complex as it all is, and as much as I've just talked your ear off about regulations and standards and thrown a whole bunch of horrible phrases at you like EN 301549, the good thing is that if you're unsure, most of the time, if you work to WCAG, then you will be most of the way there. So, yeah, the Accessible Canada Act, the legislation in the US, the UK through the EU, they all eventually taper down, and you will get to some form of WCAG eventually. So there might be other things you need to do, but WCAG will be the bulk of it. So if you're ever unsure, that's probably the thing that you should aim for. And WCAG, if you've not come across it before, it aims to make products or digital products perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So it's a set of criteria and they all fit into these categories. So can you perceive the content? Can you operate it? Can you understand it? And does it work with a bunch of tools like screen readers and screen magnifiers and those sorts of things? WCAG has three levels. There's A, there's AA, and there's AAA. I don't know what the A stands for, presumably accessibility, but it's essentially levels 1, 2, and 3 is the way we can think of them. And they stack. So you can't be level AA compliant if you have failures against any of the A criteria. You have to meet all of the A criteria and then meet all of the AA criteria in order to be considered AA compliant. And AA compliant is where the laws all sit. AAA is then you're supposed to take elements of AAA and put them in where they would be useful, but the law kind of aims for that middle of the rung level. It's not always recommended as well to go for AAA as a blanket approach. Often what we see when we inspire people to do accessibility is they go, AA is mandated, but we're going to go above and beyond and we're going to do AAA. And actually, sometimes that is not always a good thing. If you take a full blanket approach, for example, and just we're going to do all of the AAA criteria for something like gov.uk. I don't know if you've been on gov.uk, but it's very much white text, black background, green button. It dabbles blue in there. It's quite a basic looking website, but when you go to it, you know it's gov.uk. If you were to then go, we're going to do AAA across the board on gov.uk, some of the brand colors wouldn't meet the contrast ratios. You'd have to start tweaking the colors. You'd have to start kind of maybe messing with the logo and whatnot to make sure that it meets certain things that doesn't have to meet in AA. And if you change all of the colors and the branding and whatever, then it might not look like gov.uk and then people might not trust it. So you could end up actually excluding more people than you would have done had you just met AA. So the AAA criteria should be added in when they're useful and when they're going to provide value, but not just as a blanket approach. Even W3C, who write WCAG, don't recommend going for AAA across the board, just as a blanket approach. But WCAG actually has two levels, really, if we're honest. I say, you should add that AAA criteria in wherever it's relevant, but what happens is inevitably, because it's not mandated, most people just ignore it. There's a lot of people who have been doing accessibility for a while who can't even name AAA criteria because they just don't check them. They just never really come into play. Organizations just want you to do AA and you just do AA. And a lot of the cognitive support, a lot of the support for people who are neurodivergent is lost because it's in that AAA criteria. So for example, there's criteria for low or no background audio, which is basically like don't have music playing in the background on your website. There is a one for interruptions, which is about things popping up and kind of breaking your flow as you're going through things. There's a one called location, which is about knowing where you are in a series of web pages or a series of pages in a flow, like breadcrumbs, I guess. And there's a one for reading level, which is making sure that the content actually makes sense to people and it's not overly complex and using Latin phrases and whatnot. And these will help people who have things like auditory processing issues, focus issues, memory issues, language processing issues, or where English maybe isn't their first language. And this will tie into common neurodivergent conditions. I've just called them conditions, and I kicked off at the start of the talk for people calling them conditions. It will affect people who are neurodivergent, who are autistic or have ADHD or anxiety or dyslexia. So accessibility is improving, but there's still a lot of people who are left in the margins, and a lot of those people are these people who are neurodivergent. Some statistics, these are quite sobering, but it's just to help you to understand how widespread accessibility needs actually are. These are some statistics which I find interesting because it just kind of highlights how many things are out of your view, I suppose, if you just look at the high level statistics that kind of get reported. So there's a misconception that accessibility is just for people with disabilities, and this is probably because there's a lack of education around accessibility. It's not taught in schools. If you do front end development, for example, if you do software engineering at university or whatever, front end development is normally a single module. And in that single module, it might skim over accessibility, but it isn't something that people learn in depth. It's you learn a whole bunch of other stuff, and then accessibility is kind of mentioned in a really low level, a really high level, sorry. So if we look at the official statistics, in the UK, 1 in 4 people have a disability. So it's more than the number of people in the UK that have brown eyes. That's around 20%. Around 25% of people in the UK have a disability. So if you think of all the people that you know who have brown eyes, more people, again, have disabilities. And the number is increasing year on year. It was around about the same 4 years ago. It was around 22% of people in the UK had a disability. Year on year, that seems to be creeping up. And this is because the prevalence of disability rises with age. And again, these statistics are creeping, but as we get older, our bodies degrade, things get more difficult. It's likely that half of us on this call will develop a disability at some point in our lives. So I guess if we change the world now, it'll benefit us later. But the prevalence of disability rises with age. So around 11% of children have a disability in the UK, around 23% of working age adults, and around 45% of adults over state pension age. So you can see, obviously, as you get up to pension age, the chances of developing a disability go up exponentially. So they're the official statistics that 1 in 4 people, they do paint a bleak picture, but it is actually far worse. The definitions and the thresholds for what is a disability can't even be isn't even agreed upon between the kind of bodies that report on this information. So I guess what it means to be disabled is not consistent. So for example, under the Equality Act, which we talked about earlier, the legislation in the UK that stops people with disabilities being discriminated against, if you get diagnosed with a condition like HIV, multiple sclerosis, or cancer, under the Equality Act, you are considered to have a disability immediately. So once you get that diagnosis, you could go to the Department for Work and Pensions and you could claim sort of disability benefits. But under these official statistics, these 1 in 4 people, which are reported by the Office for National Statistics, you're only considered to have a disability once your health declines to a level where you can no longer do tasks that they outline in the census. So you could be in receipt of disability benefits and be considered to have a disability under the Equality Act, but not be included in that 1 in 4 people if you can still walk more than 20 yards unaided, or you can still feed yourself and shower yourself and all of these things, because the questions for how they define a disability or the thresholds are very different. There's also mental health issues where there's missing data because mental health conditions are an impairment, but they don't always meet the threshold to be considered a disability. So, for example, in DWP, I worked on the bereavement service, where, if your wife or your husband dies, then you can get, well, if your partner dies, if you're married or in a civil partnership, you can get financial support from the government. In those situations where we were doing user research, we found that people who were bereaved were massively impaired. They couldn't take in the content on the website we were showing them. They couldn't navigate through it because they couldn't remember things that they'd entered previously. there was a real impairment there, but a bereavement would never be considered a disability and they'd never be included in that 1 in 4 people because it doesn't reach the threshold that they're asking for when they're trying to work out the Office for National Statistics data. And actually, 34% of impairments that were reported into 2024 were categorized as mental health issues. So there's a lot of people in the population, like around a third, who have mental health problems, but not all of them people are going to be included in that 1 in 4 people. So there's a lot of people who rely on accessibility, they rely on things being easy to understand, but they're not going to be in that 1 in 4 people when you look at that kind of group. Non-visible disabilities, there's a lot of, again, missing data. So 85% of people with a visible disability also have a non-visible one. And non-visible just means you can't see it. You can look at somebody who uses a wheelchair and you can infer just from looking at them that they probably have a disability. With hidden disabilities, it's not always clear. So things like autism, ADHD, those sorts of things can be considered disabilities if the impairment is great enough. But if you were just to look at that person, it's unlikely that you would know that they had a disability. So that's what we mean when we say non-visible. Um, they're less obvious. And again, the official statistics, that 1 in 4 people, they focus on things like how far can you walk, and therefore a lot of the people with hidden disabilities, even though they're in receipt of disability benefits, again, are missing from that data. Then we have hidden disabilities. So these are the same as non-visible, but with a slight difference in that the motive around it is different. So some people intentionally hide their disabilities because of the stigma and the unfair treatment that comes with it. So, for example, you might have dyslexia. It might be at the level where it's considered to be a disability, and then but you might be open to talking about it. So you might go to interviews, you might talk to your employer, and you might say, these are the problems that I have, and this is the things that I need in order to be able to navigate that situation. But then other people might be in that situation and they don't want to tell you. They're like, I'm gonna just say that I don't have any problems and I'm just gonna crack on with it because I think that if I tell them, then there's gonna be I'm gonna get punished or there's gonna be missed opportunities or and there's a lot of kind of stigma attached to it. So a non-visible disability and a hidden disability, the difference between them is often the motive and the willingness for people to open up about them, I suppose. And this is often because 1 in 3 people show unconscious bias towards people with disabilities. It's higher than the unconscious bias towards race or gender. And this means that it's important to know that it's unconscious, like people don't realize they do it. But people naturally assume that people who have impairments or disabilities are less capable than those without. And it affects things like salaries, it affects things like job offers, it affects things like promotions. People are generally just seen as being less competent than people who don't have impairments. And this means that, for example, autistic people earn on average around 33% less than colleagues who are doing the same job. And you're also less likely to be employed at all. Only around 27% of people with disabilities are employed globally. So this unconscious bias is real. Like if you ask people directly, they're probably not aware that this happens. They'll go, well, if they can do the job and they do it as well as the other people, absolutely they should be paid the same. But this unconscious bias comes into it where people just make assumptions or they don't necessarily connect with that person in the same way. They're not like them, and therefore they promote the people that are like them, and this sort of thing kind of happens. So I guess when we just kind of talk through them last few slides, like the need for accessibility is massively underestimated. 1 in 4 people is a statistic that is used to understand long-term disability trends in a population of people, not how many people actually need accessibility. And the reason that I mention this, and the reason why I've kind of talked about these last sort of 10 slides or so, is that when we talk about accessibility and the need for it, this 1 in 4, or it was 1 in 5 people, gets thrown around a lot. They say, oh, 1 in 5 people need accessibility, but the majority of people should be able to use it. And I think there's so many people missing from the data that we cannot possibly make assumptions that, only 1 in 4 people need accessibility. Like I've seen it firsthand that people who are bereaved need it. I've seen it firsthand that people there's a lot of people who rely on accessibility features even though they don't have disabilities. So if anyone ever throws that figure around, just know that there's a lot of other people that they're kind of omitting. So I talked a little bit about impairments in there, but an impairment and a disability is not the same thing. The official statistics, like I've kind of slated the official statistics here, and they're not. They're good for what they're supposed to be used for, which is tracking long-term trends of disability in a population of people. But the reason why they're bad when we use them to refer to accessibility is that they look at disability, and if for accessibility, we should be looking at impairment. And an impairment is it's a medical, it's the condition or the symptoms that that person experiences. So, for example, if you have low vision or blindness, the other symptoms that you experience, your vision is impaired. A disability is when a person finds it difficult to perform everyday tasks that's considered comfortable for most people. So this is kind of the way that it kind of gets coined in the kind of more official um, definitions for it. Like if you look it up, they'll talk about everyday tasks and those sorts of things. But there's two different ways of we can think about disability, and one is called the medical model. And this is where it focuses on a person's disability being due to their impairment and that it's a condition to be fixed or cured with medicine. It's the medical model of disability. So if we were to look at an example under the medical model, we could say Sam cannot enjoy the cinema because they are blind. Now, if we look at the newer model, which is the social model, and this is the one that I recommend everyone kind of adheres to or looks through the lens of when they're trying to look at accessibility, this is that a person's disability is due to an environment or a society not accommodating their impairments. So rather than saying, well, you can't do that because you're blind, now we can look at the example and say, Sam cannot enjoy the cinema because audio descriptions are not available. So it takes the blame off Sam and their impairments, and it puts the blame on the fact that the cinema isn't providing an adequate environment in order for Sam to then be able to enjoy the movie like anybody else. So there is this thought often that people can't do things because they are disabled, but actually it's the environment that disables them. And this is an important point, I suppose, to take away is that an impairment doesn't always mean that somebody has a disability. So, for example, I have ADHD, I have autism. I don't I don't identify as being disabled, but I definitely have impairments. There's certain days where I can't get stuff done because, my brain's a mess or whatever. So I definitely have needs on certain days, but I wouldn't consider myself to be disabled, but I do need accessible, like plain language and those sorts of things definitely helps. And another example of this, I suppose, or a more easy to understand example, a very obvious one, is to imagine that you're colorblind and it's your job to analyze pandemic statistics. So this is a high stakes situation. Everyone can probably remember how crazy the pandemic was. Lives were at risk and everything was really scary in the beginning. And being able to analyze data could be the difference between life and death for a lot of people. So this is a real slide which Boris Johnson and Chris Whitty showed on the news. This kind of highlights that most of the UK government runs on Excel spreadsheets, but that's probably a talk for a whole different day. But this was a genuine slide they showed on the TV, and it shows it's a heat map for hospitals with over 100 COVID-19 patients in October on the 30th of October, 2020 or whenever it was. It's a red, amber, green status. So you have a grid, they've colored in boxes for red, boxes for amber, and boxes for green. And this is supposed to highlight whether a hospital is safe to go to or whether it's at capacity full of COVID patients. So you don't want to be going to the red ones. There's probably people in the corridors, coughing and those sorts of things. The green ones are probably safer. But if you are colorblind, and if we run this through a colorblind simulator, you just have three shades of amber. So they're shown this key or this legend, but to you, there's no red, amber, green. There's just amber, amber, amber. And in a lot of cases where this happens in a product where people have the choice to use it, they just won't use it. But this could mean life or death in extreme circumstances like COVID. So it's important that obviously there's a different way about getting that information out, whether it's patterns or numbers or descriptions or whatever you can put in that box. But if people can't see the color, they can still get the information out in a different way. And this is a similar example, which is the BBC Sport website, where they show the Premier League table, they show the form of the team, they show you the last 5 games, whether they won, lost, or drew. And they also use color, so they use green for a win, red for a loss, and they use gray for a draw. But they just put a W in the box. So even if you can't see the green, you can see the W and you still know the team won. And something like that's kind of what I'm talking about, I suppose, when we look at that COVID map. They could have just put an X in the box for ones you shouldn't go to, and a tick in the box for ones that you should, and a dash in the box for ones that are kind of, I don't know. But even that would have allowed people who are colorblind to get the information out. And colorblindness is always a really good example of an impairment versus a disability because 1 in 12 men are colorblind or have a color vision deficiency, and 1 in 200 women do. So there's a lot of people who have this problem, particularly males, but alone it would never be considered to be a disability. If you just have color blindness, you'll never be considered in that 1 in 4 people. But you definitely, based on that last example, have a need for something to be accessible. So if you take people with a color vision deficiency and you add them to people with ADHD and dyslexia and autism, all them things, you can very quickly see how many more people need accessibility than just 1 in 4 people. And as I said before, people are not usually disabled by their impairments. They're disabled by poorly designed environments. And around 67% of failures, when we say accessibility failures, we talk about WCAG earlier, the WCAG standard. A lot of the web content accessibility guideline failures that you see, around 67% of them originate in the design according to a report by DQ and Anna E. Cook. But it means that as designers, like I was a designer back in the day, so I feel comfortable saying that, we're to blame for a lot of this stuff. But yeah, as a designer, like if we design something which the devs are going to struggle to make accessible, we have just as much responsibility around that. I think a lot of the time people throw it over the wall and expect the devs to do a good job on it, but their hands are kind of tied by the design. So if 67% of accessibility failures originate in the design, that's where we should be fixing them. It's around 6 times more expensive to fix an accessibility failure that existed in the design once it's in dev. It's around 10 times more expensive to fix it once it gets into test, and it's around 30 times more expensive to fix it once it gets into production. So if you just put accessibility on the back burner and you're like, we're going to deliver everything first, and then we're going to go back and make it accessible, you can expect to pay around 30 times more to do that than if you just made it accessible in the design in the first place and did it as part of that synchronous delivery of stuff. So yeah, as I said before, designers, we must shoulder a lot of the blame. I think we often create the barriers which can make people look less competent, can make people who are neurodivergent appear less competent than their peers. And then this kind of feeds into that existing bias that they are less competent because they can't use the tool that we've designed, and then therefore they're less likely to get promoted or get a job and that sort of thing. We often design things which fit in with our own worldview. So this is an example of King's Cross Station. It was refurbished around, I think it was around 2018 or something, and this black sticker appeared across the window. So in the image, you can see there's a woman who uses a wheelchair who is trying to have a conversation at the dropped part of the desk. And normally that drop part of the desk would allow them to have a face-to-face conversation with the customer service rep on the other side. But in the refurb, they painted all of the desk black, and they've obviously missed the reason why it was dropped at a 45-degree angle, and they've just put a black sticker over the window so that everything's square and everything's nice and everything kind of there's nice lines there in the design. But it means now that this woman in the wheelchair cannot have a conversation face to face. They're always going to be talked down to because the person on the other side of the glass has to talk over the top of that big black sticker. So again, this is something I suppose was more of a design issue than it was. I don't think they've obviously just decided to do that in the build. That'll have been part of the design. And I guess we need to try and focus on making things accessible by design, not accessible because they've passed an audit. So a lot of times people think something is only accessible once it's WCAG 2.2 compliant to level AA. And I think as designers, we need to start trying to think of making things accessible by design and not just doing whatever we want and then hoping somebody else will figure it out. So if you are a designer and you're designing things, use accessibility annotation kits and provide things for the developer that they will need when they're coming to put your designs into the build. So for example, if you're knocking out designs in Figma, and you're using icons and images and those sorts of things, providing alternative text is a good way to make sure that it doesn't then have to get fixed later on. A lot of the times, from what I've seen anyway, working in organizations, after after I worked in DWP, I worked for a big American organization called Elastic. And we found that, when you've got a lot of developers just doing things, if you don't provide them things in the design, most of the time they're just going to have a go. They're just going to do what they think's best. And then if you don't catch it, it might end up in production. If you are working closely with a developer, they might come and ask you, but you're still putting the onus on them to do something when they're just supposed to be developing the thing that you've designed. So providing things like labels for icons and alternative text for images, and if you need to put a skip link on there, showing them, this is where the skip link should appear and this is what it should link to, those can all make the job of the developer much easier when they come to build it, and it means that you're less likely to get bugs and things that you find later on where it doesn't behave quite as you anticipate that it would. And another thing for design, there's a thing called COGA, the Cognitive Accessibility Guidelines. They're new, they're still in draft. They're being developed by W3C, who write the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are something that I just kind of want to quickly run through because I think they're really useful when we're thinking about design. So it's a set of 9 principles. There is a spoiler in that most of them are just good design. Hopefully when I whiz through them, you'll go, well, yeah, that's obvious, but hopefully it is. If it's obvious, then good. If it's not, then it's, something to take away. But they are just a set of 9 principles. And I guess the caveat is that I'm going to show one example for each principle because I don't have time to go way in detail on them. But I'll show you one of the principles and then kind of one example of how you can meet that principle. But I do recommend if you've got time, go through these in your own time and kind of read about them a little bit more. So the first one is to help users to understand what things are and how to use them. So this could be an example of just using icons consistently. So for example, if you have 4 buttons, one says delete, one says remove, one says clear, and one just has a bin icon, but they all have a bin icon on, it becomes really difficult to understand what that is and how to use it. If you've seen 3 different buttons that do 3 different things with the same icon on, can you really be sure what it's going to do when you see that button on its own? The second one is to help users find what they need. So an example of this is just to provide multiple ways to find content, provide a sitemap, provide, links on pages in line when they're relevant, provide a robust search feature. These sorts of things can really help people to find stuff that they need. On gov.uk, they do this quite well with like popular articles and things that they know that people come looking for. They kind of surface to the top. The third one is to use clear and understandable content. So this is an example of just using plain language. So you could say the burger was tasty, or you could say the umami and brioche combination was a masterpiece of culinary composition, where the subtle interplay of flavors and textures coalesced into a dynamic flavor profile that was nothing short of a transcendent culinary experience. Burger was tasty is way easier to understand. We should just be trying to make things as easy as possible. I think one of the problems we have is that in school, we're always taught to make a language more complex. You do creative writing and you get marked down if it's too simple. And we're taught all the way through school to complicate our language as much as possible so that it sounds smarter. And actually, what people need a lot of the time is for it to be simpler. So it's really challenging to unlearn all of the stuff that you learned in school and unlearn all of them big words. But the more plain that we can make the language, the easier it is for people who have things like dyslexia, the easier it is for people where English isn't their first language, the easier it is for everyone. You could have a doctor who can understand all the Latin names for something, but hopefully they would also understand if you just wrote it in plain language as well, whereas it doesn't always work the same way around. The fourth one is to help users avoid mistakes and know how to correct them. So this is just using things like clear error messages. So for example, if this is an example from gov.uk where we have 3 input fields for a date, it's expecting the input to be in numbers. So it's looking for an example like 27/3/2017. The invalid example, like they've entered 6/3/2077 for when was your passport issued, and it's just saying enter a valid date. That is a valid date. That is a real date, and it is in the format they asked for. It's using numbers, but what they're getting at is that the date that your passport was issued cannot be in the future. It must be in the past. So if you know that, tell the user that, and then they can fix it. When you see things like invalid or like malformed syntax and things, which I've seen on error messages before, that often isn't useful for anyone. If you know what went wrong, tell them what went wrong, and then they can fix it. The fifth one is help users to focus. So we've probably all seen interfaces where they don't really know what you're supposed to be doing. So they just give you everything and you're supposed to figure it out. Avoid clutter, scope the task clearly. Like the whole point of a user journey is that you should be able to handhold the user through that in order for them to be able to get to the point where they succeed. If you don't know what they're supposed to be doing and you just go, well, we'll just throw all of the user interface onto one screen and they can figure it out, most of the time that's going to cause issues for people. So just try and, yeah, scope things easier. People, especially if they've got focus issues or, they get overwhelmed by a lot of information, the simpler you can make it, the better. 6 is to ensure processes do not rely on memory. So an example of this is we've probably all done mandatory training at some point where they'll say like, in the training video you watched in section 3, what do you think Mike could have done differently in the future? If you're like me, you're probably thinking, who was Mike? Never mind, what were they doing? And then you've got to click back to go back to the video, and then the whole thing normally blows up and you've got to start again. So if people need to remember something, then replay that information. 7 is to provide help and support. So this is to make sure that phone numbers are available, email addresses are available. Like if somebody needs some help, link them to documentation, link them to phone numbers, like give them a way that they can progress. This is an example from Get Your State Pension, but they say they've got a link which is they're asking for a code. What is your invitation code? There's a link that says I don't know my code, which links you to documentation where it shows you the letter and where to find the code. If you still can't find it, it says get help with your claim. Here's a telephone number if you're in the UK. Here's a telephone number if you're in Ireland. Here's British Sign Language contacts if you need that. It just kind of outlines everything that you can do. 8 is support adaptation and personalization. So this is things like support in dark mode, supporting different font size settings in the browser, those sorts of things. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And the last one is test with real users. I don't have an example for this one because it's pretty obvious, but yeah, basically, if you're going to say something's accessible, at least test it with people who have accessibility needs, and then you'll kind of have an idea. With WCAG, you can be compliant without ever having to talk to users, and that is not really okay. I've seen lots of services which were compliant, which didn't work in the real world, and I've seen lots of services which weren't quite compliant that actually work quite well. So testing with real users is a real good way to understand if the thing that you've built is actually fit for purpose. Yeah, there's the 9 again. There is a link to it. I'll share that out afterwards. But yeah, definitely worth having a look into. And if you need more examples, I can provide more examples as well. So wrap up quickly, things to remember. The statistics are flawed. More people rely on accessibility than 1 in 4 people. Humans are biased, so don't assume that you know what people need. You should talk to them, you should include them, and you should try and learn what it is that they need from them. Don't be the person that says we don't have any users with disabilities, even if you can't see any users with disabilities because of hidden ones and non-visible ones and impairments. Like there's a good chance that you do have people who have accessibility needs in there. Hire neurodivergent people, but make sure you support them properly. So don't just hire them for their specialist skills, like make sure that you support them in the way that they need supported. And remember that accessibility is a user need. It isn't a technical specification. So we can work to the standard. We should work to the standard, but we should be looking at it from a user needs perspective so that even people with impairments will have needs. And if we can cater for those, then we can really make inclusive products as opposed to just things that hit standards. Design for accessibility, consider it, plan it, annotate it, and meet the standards. At the very least, be compliant, but then try and go beyond that. Do research with users, consider COGA and things like design justice, because accessibility is our starting block, but inclusion needs to be our finish line. So we should really be looking to go and just make sure that we include as many people as possible, because I think as good as the standards are getting, there's still so many people that have accessibility needs that aren't being met. And that is everything that I've got. I appreciate the last half of that was probably really rushed. Maybe the ADHD won a little bit, but I was just trying to get through it as rapidly as possible and stay on time. So yeah, thanks. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got Mastodon, but mainly I use Blue Sky these days. I've canned Twitter off, as many people have done. But yeah, feel free to reach out if you've got any questions on it. And I think if we've got time, we'll can have a look at some of them now.